I'm Ruby Stroll, 34, a public school teacher who built everything from the ground up. For years, I supported my husband's career, held our home together, and made space for his family, even when it cost me. But when his sister slapped our 5-year-old son at dinner, and he laughed, I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been dismissed by someone you bent over backwards for? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to draw a hard line to protect yourself or someone you love, hit like and subscribe. What happened next caught a lot of people off guard. I met Lance when I was 20, halfway through my education degree and working weekends at a bookstore to keep the student loans from piling too fast. He was a finance major, already interning at some wealth management firm downtown, the kind of person who made 5-year plans and actually stuck to them. I liked how steady he seemed. I liked how he talked about compound interest and family with the same level of seriousness. It felt like I could build something with him. He came from a close-knit family, at least by appearance. His parents were married, still hosted Sunday dinners every other week, and his younger sister Mia was practically attached at the hip. She was finishing up law school when I met her, tall, opinionated, confident in a way that could be both admirable and exhausting. Lance warned me early on that she was intense. What he didn't say was that Mia's opinions were usually treated as facts within the family, and questioning them wasn't something anyone did, especially not Lance. Still, I tried. From the very beginning, I made space for all of them. When holidays came around, we always traveled to his parents' house, even if it meant taking unpaid time off or booking last-minute flights. When I suggested alternating years so we could visit my family, it became a debate about how his mom gets anxious when we're not all together. So I let it go. When Mia's marriage fell apart, she called Lance before she even told her husband she was leaving. Within 24 hours, he was carrying her suitcase into our guest room like it was a war zone evac. I didn't hesitate. I stocked the fridge with her favorite yogurt, moved around my work meetings so I could pick her up from appointments, and tried to offer the kind of support I imagined I'd want if my life had just split down the middle. She stayed with us for 6 months. Rent-free, contribution-free. I told myself family was family, and I didn't resent it at the time. Not really. Looking back now, I wonder if that was the moment something started to tilt. By the time we had our son Bobby, I was working full-time as a 3rd-grade teacher. My days started at 5:30 a.m. and didn't end until I'd prepped lessons, packed lunches, folded laundry, and finally had a quiet moment to sit. Lance made good money by then, and we could have afforded help, but he always said, "You're just better at managing the house stuff." And I was, because I had to be. He traveled often. When he was home, he was tired. Always tired. Bobby was born in June, loud, curious, impossibly expressive from day one. He babbled early, walked early, and had a natural confidence that reminded me of no one in Lance's family. He'd ask 100 questions before breakfast, narrate stories with hand gestures and sound effects, and could recite entire books from memory if you gave him long enough. I loved it. I never wanted him to shrink. But even as a toddler, Mia would roll her eyes when he got too chatty at family dinners. She'd joke, "He's going to be one of those kids who talks through the whole movie." I'd smile tightly and change the subject. Lance never stepped in. He'd just glance at me with that look, the one that said, "Let it go. It's not worth the fight." Sometimes I wondered if he even noticed. I can count on one hand the number of times Lance backed me up when it came to Bobby. When I said no to sugary snacks before bedtime and Lance gave him a cookie anyway, I let it slide. When I suggested we cut back on screen time and Lance said I was overthinking it, I tried not to take it personally. But over time, those small things became the pattern. I'd set a boundary. He'd undermine it with a shrug and a joke. And when I brought it up later, he'd say I was being too sensitive. I learned not to ask for much. Mia, meanwhile, became something like a permanent fixture in our lives. She'd drop by unannounced, pick Bobby up from school without checking with me first, and insert herself into conversations like she had equal say in how we parented. Once, when I told Bobby he needed to use his inside voice at the dinner table, Mia looked at me and said, "He's just expressive." Let the boy speak. And yet, months later, she'd scold him for interrupting her, snapping, "Let the adults talk, Bobby." It was always like that with her. Her mood set the rules. If she was feeling generous, Bobby could do no wrong. If she was irritated, he became disrespectful, too much rude. And Lance? He'd change the subject. Or laugh. Or worse, agree. I used to wonder if I was the only one seeing it. If maybe I was being too defensive, too protective. But then Bobby started asking to skip Sunday dinners. He said Mia scared him. That she talked like she was mad, even when no one else was mad. That's when I started paying closer attention. I noticed how Lance would tense if Mia disagreed with him, how his voice would flatten just a bit when she was around. It occurred to me that he didn't just love his sister, he feared her, too. Or at least, he feared the fallout of pushing back. And if he couldn't push back on her, how could he ever defend Bobby from her? There were moments when I wanted to bring it all up, everything. How Mia treated Bobby. How Lance let her. How tired I was of being the only adult trying to hold this family together. But there was always a reason not to. A birthday, a work trip, a school event. Something to delay the conversation, to push it to the side until later. Later just never came. Instead, I kept showing up. I hosted the dinners, coordinated Bobby's activities, remembered his parents' birthdays, and sent polite thank you texts to Mia for gifts she barely looked at when she handed them over. I smiled in the family photos, kept the peace, and kept my mouth shut. Because that's what you do, right? You sacrifice a little. You give the benefit of the doubt. You prioritize the family, even when you're not sure they'd do the same for you. But the truth is, I was tired long before that night. I just didn't know how close I was to the edge. Mia had always had a strong personality. Even before the divorce, she leaned toward bluntness, the kind that could pass for honesty if you weren't on the receiving end. But something changed after she left her husband. She didn't just get sharper, she got meaner. The first time I really noticed it, we were sitting at her parents' dining table for one of those mandatory Sunday dinners. Bobby was retelling a story from school, all wide-eyed and breathless, hopping from one detail to the next like only a 5-year-old can. Mia cut him off mid-sentence with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "God, he never stops talking," she said, looking around like she expected us all to agree. "Do you guys even get a moment of silence in your house?" I waited for Lance to say something. Even just a small, "Hey, he's 5, would have been enough. But he just smiled into his plate. Maybe he thought it was easier that way. Maybe it was. That moment stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, the comments became more frequent. Always disguised as jokes. Always directed at Bobby. "He's gonna need some structure or he'll be impossible in school. Don't you think it's time he learned to wait his turn to speak? Some kids need a firmer hand." I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt at first. Told myself she was projecting. That she was going through something hard and maybe didn't know how to process it. But then Bobby started coming home with questions I didn't know how to answer. One night, as I was helping him into his pajamas, he asked, "Why doesn't Aunt Mia like me?" I froze. "What makes you think that?" "She said I talk too much, and it gives her a headache," he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. "She said boys who talk too much are annoying." He was 5. 5. And already internalizing the idea that being himself, curious, expressive, enthusiastic, was a problem. I brought it up to Lance. Carefully. Late at night, after Bobby was asleep, the lights low. I told him what Bobby said, the way he said it. The weight in his little voice. Lance sighed and rubbed his eyes like I'd just told him we needed to replace the water heater. "She's old school," he said, like that explained everything. "She's blunt." "You know that." "That's not blunt, Lance. That's unkind." He didn't argue. He just changed the subject. The truth was, Lance didn't push back on Mia. Not about anything. If she wanted to host Christmas dinner, even though we'd already made plans with my family, we went to Mia's. If she made a passive-aggressive comment about how we spoil Bobby, Lance would nod vaguely and move on. If I said we needed to set boundaries with her, he'd say I was overreacting. "She doesn't mean anything by it." That became the refrain. She didn't mean anything by it. So, by that logic, I wasn't allowed to feel anything either. No hurt, no anger. No justified instinct to protect my son from someone who clearly didn't enjoy being around him. At some point, she stopped hiding it. She'd scold Bobby in front of everyone for interrupting, for being too loud, for asking questions. He'd retreat into himself like a dimmed light. And no one said a word. Not Lance. Not his parents. Not me, if I'm being honest. I'd give Bobby a reassuring squeeze under the table, whisper "you're okay" into his ear, and pretend I didn't feel my own body tighten every time she opened her mouth. Because if I said something, it would cause a scene. And if I caused a scene, I'd be the problem. The dramatic wife. The oversensitive mom. The outsider who didn't get how their family worked. I remember one night after dinner, Bobby came to me while I was loading the dishwasher. Mia had snapped at him for fidgeting during dessert. He hadn't even said a word, just swung his feet under the table like any restless little boy would. She said I'm rude, he whispered, tugging at the hem of my shirt. Am I rude, Mom? I knelt down beside him and looked him straight in the eye. No, baby. You're not rude. You're learning. And some people forget what that looks like. He nodded slowly, but I could see it. The seed had been planted. The first crack in his sense of self. The kind that makes a child shrink without even realizing they're doing it. I brought it up again with Lance, more firmly this time. We were in the car, driving home. Bobby had fallen asleep in the back seat. I turned to him and said, "We need to talk about how Mia speaks to him." He kept his eyes on the road. "It's not ideal," he said. "But what do you want me to do? Start a fight with my sister every time she makes a comment?" "I want you to stand up for your son," I said. "I want you to care more about him than about keeping things civil with Mia." "That's not fair," he muttered, fingers tightening on the steering wheel. No. What wasn't fair was watching our son shrink at family dinners while the adults around him pretended not to see. What wasn't fair was being the only one trying to draw a line and being treated like I was the unreasonable one. After that conversation, I stopped bringing it up. Not because it stopped bothering me, it didn't, but because I realized Lance had made his choice. Or maybe he didn't see it as a choice at all. Maybe this was just how it worked in their family. You prioritized harmony over honesty. You let the dominant voices lead, even when they were cruel. You looked the other way for the sake of keeping peace. I started adjusting in small ways. Skipping Sunday dinners when I could. Signing Bobby up for weekend activities that gave us an excuse not to be there. I told Lance it was for Bobby's social development. In a way, that was true. But it was also about protecting him from a house where he felt unwanted. Still, there were times we couldn't avoid it. Birthdays. Holidays. Obligations that came with pressure and guilt if we declined. And Mia was always there, sharper than ever. More entitled than ever. At one point, she started making comments about Bobby's volume in public. We were at a restaurant, nothing fancy, just a noisy little Italian place near her apartment. Bobby was telling us about a book he'd read at school, his hands animated, his voice a little louder than usual, but not disruptive. Mia leaned across the table, gave him a pointed look, and said, "Indoor voice, kid. You're not the only one here." I looked at Lance. He was buttering a piece of bread. I opened my mouth. Closed it. Bobby looked down at his plate and didn't speak again until we got home. Later that night, as I tucked him in, he whispered, "Maybe I talk too much." I kissed his forehead. "You're exactly the way you're supposed to be." But I felt it, too, the way he was starting to believe the version of himself they were selling. The one where he was too loud, too much, too inconvenient. It's funny how the smallest cracks can eventually collapse a whole structure. The first few times, I thought I could patch them up. Smooth them over. Hope for a change. But the cracks didn't heal. They widened. And I couldn't shake the feeling that eventually, something was going to give. It was a Sunday dinner like so many others. Lance's parents had invited everyone over, and despite every instinct telling me to make an excuse, I went. I told myself Bobby would be okay. That I could keep things light. That if Mia said anything, I'd find a way to diffuse it. Just get through the evening. Bobby had brought a little poster he made for school, a science project on the life cycle of frogs. He was so proud. Carried it in both hands on the way in. Even asked if he could show Grandpa and Aunt Mia when dinner was over. Lance smiled and said sure. I should have felt reassured by that. I wanted to. Dinner started out normally enough. Mia was already 2 glasses into her wine when we arrived, her voice louder than usual, her opinions even more pointed. Lance's mom made lasagna. His dad made a joke about the weather. Everything felt tight, like a room with no windows. Bobby sat beside me, Lance on my other side. Mia was directly across from him. Bobby had been quiet for most of the meal. I'd whispered to him before we walked in, "Let's try not to interrupt tonight, okay?" And he nodded, all serious, the way kids do when they really want to try. But then halfway through dinner, his excitement got the better of him. He'd taken one bite of garlic bread, looked up suddenly, and said, "Guess what? My science project is about frogs, and did you know they start as eggs and then grow legs?" And it wasn't loud. Not really. Just fast. His voice overlapping someone else's mid-sentence, maybe Mia's, maybe Lance's dad. I honestly don't remember. But I do remember what happened next. Mia slapped him. Open palm. Right across the back of his head. It wasn't a love tap. It wasn't a playful nudge. It was the sound of contact, flesh on bone, sharp and sudden and final. Bobby went still. The fork in my hand slipped and clattered onto my plate. Lance looked up but didn't move. Mia stared at Bobby like she was the one who'd been wronged. "I'm talking," she snapped. "Wait your turn." My son didn't say a word. He didn't cry. His mouth stayed open like the sentence was still trapped there, waiting for permission to finish itself. I looked at Lance. He laughed. Not a full laugh. Not loud. But enough. Enough to make it worse. He looked at Mia and said, "He's gotta learn someday." I've never felt silence like that. Bobby's eyes filled instantly. He didn't make a sound, just blinked hard like he was trying not to let them fall. I reached for him, gently, without saying anything, and wrapped my fingers around his. I stood up. Nobody else moved. Nobody asked what was happening. Nobody apologized or looked shocked or even confused. It was like this didn't warrant a reaction. Like it was a normal thing that could happen at a normal dinner. I bent down, picked up Bobby's little science poster from beside his chair, and nodded at Lance. "We're leaving," I said. Lance looked at me like I'd overcooked the drama. "Seriously?" I didn't answer. I just walked out, still holding Bobby's hand. He stayed quiet the whole way to the car. In the driver's seat, I strapped him in, checked twice to make sure the buckle was secure even though I always check. His eyes were red, his lip trembling, but still he said nothing. I wanted to tell him I was sorry. That I should have never brought him there. That I should have said something sooner. But I didn't. I just drove us home. That night, I sat on the edge of his bed after tucking him in. He asked if he could sleep with the light on. I said yes. Then he asked the question that broke me open. Did I do something bad? I shook my head and touched his hair. No. You were telling a story. That's all. But she hit me. I know, I said. And it wasn't okay. Daddy laughed. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice calm. Sometimes people laugh when they don't know what to do. But you didn't do anything wrong. You know that, right? He didn't answer. Just rolled over, pulling his blanket up to his chin. I sat there until his breathing deepened, until I was sure he was asleep. Then I walked back into the hallway and stared at the closed door to our bedroom for a long time before I opened it. Lance was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone like it was any other night. Like our son hadn't just been struck across the head by his aunt in front of the entire family. Like we hadn't just walked out of a house where no one blinked when it happened. "You let her hit him," I said, quietly. "She didn't hit him," he replied without looking up. "She tapped him." "You're blowing this way out of proportion." My voice stayed level. "You watched it happen." He sighed. "Mia's not great with kids. You know that. She's not his parent." He finally looked at me. "So what? You want me to go over there and start a war over this?" I stared at him. "No. I want you to act like his father." His jaw tightened. He put the phone down. "Look," he said. He interrupted. "She shouldn't have touched him, fine. But he's a boy. He'll be okay." That was it. That was all he had to say. There was no moment of regret. No apology. No acknowledgement that what had happened was completely unacceptable. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't say anything else at all. The next day, I packed a bag for Bobby and one for myself. I called in a personal day at work. I told Lance I needed space, and I took it. We stayed with a friend of mine 2 towns over for a few days. I spent the nights watching Bobby sleep and thinking about how many times I had chosen peace over protection. How many times I had prioritized civility over clarity. 3 days later, I drove back to the house, walked in while Lance was still at work, and left the divorce papers on the kitchen table. His name and mine in 2 bold fonts, side by side on every page. A line dividing what used to be ours into his and mine. I took Bobby's frog poster off the fridge and packed it in my bag. This time, when we left, we weren't coming back. That night, after I got Bobby settled into the guest room at my friend Julia's house, I sat on the floor beside the bed and watched him sleep. His face was soft again, unguarded in the way only children can be when they've finally let go of the day. He still had a faint red mark on the side of his head, not a bruise, not something visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but I knew it was there. I saw it every time I closed my eyes. I stayed awake most of the night, replaying everything. The slap. The silence. Lance's laugh. I kept coming back to it, like a record skipping on the same awful second. I had spent years navigating that family, smoothing rough edges, overlooking things that felt off, telling myself that being the bigger person meant not reacting. I justified Mia's sharpness, Lance's passivity, his parents' selective attention. I told myself it wasn't that bad. But this was different. This was the line. And I hadn't even known we were that close to it until we were already on the other side. The next morning, I texted Lance. Just 4 words, "We need to talk." He didn't reply for hours. When he did, it was short. "You're being dramatic. Come home." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I made Bobby breakfast in Julia's kitchen while she got her kids ready for school. She didn't ask questions. Just poured me coffee and handed me the good mug, the one she saved for mornings when someone needed comfort more than caffeine. When I finally called Lance that evening, I tried to keep my voice steady. I told him we weren't staying away to prove a point. I told him I needed him to understand what happened, really understand it. That someone hit our child, and his reaction had been to laugh. He sighed before I even finished. "You're blowing this up," he said. "She didn't hit him. It wasn't like that." "You were there," I said. "You saw it." "She didn't mean it." Mia was frustrated. Bobby was being loud. He interrupted. "He's 5. Silence. "You always do this," he said eventually. "Take a small thing and make it into some moral crisis. She's my sister. You want me to cut her off over a little slap. I want you to care that our son was humiliated. In front of your entire family. And that he came home asking if he was a bad kid." His voice dropped. "You're impossible to talk to when you're like this." I didn't reply. There was nothing else to say. After I hung up, I sat at the table for a long time. Bobby was in the living room drawing quietly with Julia's daughter. He looked small but calm. Like himself again. And I realized I hadn't seen him like that in a while, relaxed, unafraid to take up space. I remembered every time I had defended that family. Every time I'd told myself Lance meant well, that Mia was going through something, that his parents were just a little old-fashioned. I thought about the Christmas when I spent the whole day cooking while Mia sat on the couch criticizing my parenting in between sips of wine. About the time Lance said nothing when his mom corrected me in front of Bobby for coddling him after he scraped his knee. About the night Lance laughed when Mia called Bobby high-strung and suggested maybe we should get him tested. And I thought about how many times I had swallowed my instincts to keep things peaceful. It hit me like a wave I didn't see coming. I had been alone in this marriage for a long time. Not in the way that looks dramatic from the outside. Not yelling, not cheating, not obvious neglect. Just absence. Absence where partnership should have been. Silence where support should have lived. I had mistaken Lance's quiet for steadiness, when really it was just detachment. Worse than that, I had kept trying to make up the difference, for Bobby. I showed up twice as hard, hoping it would somehow even the scale. It didn't. All it did was teach my son that speaking up was dangerous. That being himself could get him slapped, and that no one would stop it. Julia didn't press me that night, but she stayed close. After we got the kids to bed, She poured us each a glass of wine and sat across from me on the couch. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said gently. "But whatever happened? I saw Bobby's face when you walked in yesterday. That wasn't just a bad dinner." I nodded slowly. Mia hit him. At the table. For interrupting. She froze. "Wait, what?" Open palm. Back of the head. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She waited. "And Lance," I said, swallowing hard. He laughed. Said, "He's gotta learn someday." Julia stared at me for a second too long. "And then what?" "I took Bobby and left." She blinked, nodded. "Good." That was the only word she said for a while. Just, "good." I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that until she said it. 2 days later, Lance came by the house. Julia wasn't home. Bobby was at school. I let him in because I needed to see his face when I said it. He stood in the doorway like he wasn't sure whether to be angry or embarrassed. I could tell he expected some kind of apology. I didn't offer one. "I can't come back from this," I said. "You understand that, right?" He crossed his arms. "You're really doing this?" "She hit our child." "I know," he said quickly, then tried to soften it. "It was wrong." I told her. "She's sorry." "No, she's not." He didn't argue. "You watched it happen," I said. "You heard him ask if he was a bad kid. And you did nothing." Lance dropped his eyes. "I didn't think it was serious enough." I finished for him. Because that's the part that matters. He looked up again, and this time there was something sharper in his expression. Not anger. Not guilt. Just discomfort. "I'm not going to raise my son in a house where no one protects him," I said. "Not from outsiders, and especially not from family." He looked around the room like maybe there was still a chance I'd change my mind. But I already had. The next morning, I filed for divorce. And for the first time in years, I didn't second-guess myself. I packed our things in silence while Lance was at work. No dramatic music, no yelling, no suitcase thrown down the stairs. Just quiet movement through a house that no longer felt like mine. I focused on the essentials: Bobby's clothes, his favorite stuffed animal, the frog poster he'd made. A few of my work folders, basic toiletries, important documents. I left behind anything that wasn't worth dragging into our next chapter. The divorce papers were already signed. I placed them neatly on the kitchen table, right next to a note that said simply, "Bobby and I are safe. Do not contact him directly." I didn't wait around for Lance to come home. I didn't want to hear the sound of disbelief turn into bargaining. Or worse, into excuses. We moved into a short-term rental the next town over. 2 bedrooms, creaky floors, older appliances. But it was clean and quiet and entirely ours. Bobby adjusted faster than I expected. He liked the light in his new room, liked the sound of the birds in the trees outside. The first night, he asked if we were going back to the mean house. I said no. He nodded once, satisfied, and went back to coloring. Lance didn't call until later that evening. I let it go to voicemail the first 2 times. On the 3rd try, I answered. "What is this?" he said. No greeting. Just a voice on the edge of anger. "You just walk out? You don't even give me a chance to, fix it?" "I gave you years," I said. "You watched what happened to our son. You laughed." "It wasn't like that." "You laughed," I repeated. "Then you defended her." He didn't deny it. Just paused, like maybe if he stayed quiet long enough, I'd soften. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said finally. She slapped his head, not his face. "It wasn't abuse. It wasn't even." I closed my eyes. "If your bar for abuse is location on the body, we have very different definitions." He exhaled hard into the phone. "You're being selfish." That word caught in my chest for half a second before I let it pass. If protecting my son makes me selfish, then I'll wear that proudly. There was a pause. Then the line went dead. The next day, his mother called. I didn't answer at first, but when she tried again that evening, I picked up. "I just think this could have been talked through," she said, her voice doing that thing where concern hides behind condescension. "Families have disagreements. You don't throw away a marriage over one incident." "One incident?" I said. "Mia hit my son." She was upset. "He was yelling and he was 5, I said. "He was telling a story." Her voice got tighter. "We all have different ways of handling things. I'm not saying it was right, but you're overreacting." Your grandson got hit at your dinner table, and no one said a word. Including you. Silence. Mia went too far, she said eventually. But divorce is drastic. Think about what you're doing to Lance. That was when I realized they would never see Bobby. Not really. They saw the family, the image, the legacy. But they didn't see the child sitting there silenced. And they didn't see the mother who had to watch it happen. I said, thinking about what I'm doing. Every step. I hung up before she could reply. That week, I called an attorney. I didn't have much saved, but Julia helped me find someone who offered sliding scale fees for women leaving difficult situations. I filed the paperwork, changed the locks on our old place, and started looking for a new preschool for Bobby. I didn't tell Lance where we'd moved. He didn't ask. At work, I kept it professional. I didn't explain. I didn't vent. I did my job and came home and poured everything I had into giving Bobby structure and calm. I built routines, morning walks before school, quiet time with books after dinner, extra hugs at drop-off. I listened when he talked, even when he rambled. Especially when he rambled. I wanted him to know his voice mattered. A week later, Mia sent a text. I heard you're staying at Julia's. I think you're making a mistake. I didn't mean to scare him. I barely touched him. You need to calm down. I didn't reply. 2 days after that, Lance tried again. Let's be civil. Think about what this is doing to Bobby. He needs both of us. He was right, in a way. Bobby needed both of us. But not like this. Not with one parent who flinched every time the other made a joke at their child's expense. Not with one who watched harm happen and minimized it afterward. What Bobby needed was safety. Stability. And I wasn't going to gamble that on the possibility that Lance might one day change his tone. When the divorce papers were officially filed and delivered, Lance sent one last message. Unbelievable. You've always had to be the hero. Congratulations. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I turned it off. In the weeks that followed, I started to feel something I hadn't in years. Stillness. Not the fragile kind that breaks under the weight of one wrong word, but the kind that holds. The kind that lets you breathe. Bobby flourished in his new school. His teacher told me he was one of the most curious kids she'd met, and that his vocabulary was unusually advanced. She said he loved science. He had brought in a poster about frogs. When I picked him up that day, he held my hand all the way to the car and said, I told everyone about frog eggs. I smiled. Did they like it? They clapped. I blinked hard and nodded. Good. I'm glad. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat on the couch with a cup of tea and opened my laptop. I started making a list of all the things I had stopped doing for myself over the last few years. Reading for pleasure. Exercising because it felt good. Seeing friends just to laugh. None of it came back at once. But the list reminded me that I still existed. That I wasn't just someone else's wife or mother or buffer. I didn't know what Lance was telling people. I assumed he framed it as a sudden, impulsive choice. That I overreacted. That I ran away. But I stopped caring. People who needed the full story would hear it in time. What mattered was that Bobby knew the truth. He knew I listened. He knew I stayed when it was hard. And he knew I left when it mattered most. In the weeks after I filed, Lance started reaching out to people we knew, mutual friends, neighbors, even parents from Bobby's old daycare, spinning his version of what had happened. He said I'd overreacted, that I was making a huge mistake. Told someone I'd snapped out of nowhere. That the stress of motherhood had made me irrational. I heard about it gradually. A woman I barely knew from Bobby's swim class messaged me late one night. Just wanted to say I support you. You don't owe anyone an explanation. I saw what happened at the dinner before everything. Another mom, someone I'd only made small talk with at school events, pulled me aside during pickup and said, for what it's worth, I think you're brave. It caught me off guard. I hadn't told her anything. I hadn't told anyone except Julia and my attorney. But it didn't matter. Word had gotten out. Not from me, but from people who had seen enough to start connecting the dots. The stories Lance told started to lose traction. Not because I contradicted them, but because people knew me. They knew I didn't make noise unless there was a reason. They'd seen me with Bobby, How I handled tantrums with patience, how I encouraged him to speak up, how I never raised my voice in front of him. They'd seen Lance too. The dismissiveness. The subtle digs. The way he deferred everything emotional to me. Eventually, people stopped asking questions and just started drifting away from him, not me. Mia, unsurprisingly, said nothing. Not to me, not to Bobby, not publicly or privately. She pretended it hadn't happened. Went on posting motivational quotes on Instagram about accountability and healing like she hadn't struck a 5-year-old for speaking too loudly. That silence made something clear. There would be no reckoning. Not from her. And honestly, I didn't expect one. But something started shifting at home. Bobby began sleeping through the night again. The nightmares stopped. He started telling longer stories, using more voices and gestures, like he was testing the air to see if it was safe again. Sometimes he'd pause in the middle of a sentence and look at me, just for a second, and I'd say, "Go on. I'm listening." And he would. The pause would disappear. He began drawing more. Frogs, mostly, and sometimes rockets. A few houses. One had just 2 windows and a single stick figure in the middle. When I asked who it was, he said, "It's me. But I'm not alone. The window is open." I didn't ask what that meant. I just hugged him and told him it was perfect. There were hard days, of course. Starting over meant starting from scratch. I had to find a new preschool, rearrange my work schedule, talk to the school counselor about what Bobby might need in the months ahead. I had to deal with Lance through lawyers, which came with expense and paperwork and long silences followed by sudden, urgent emails about visitation schedules or furniture claims. But through it all, there was relief. A quiet sense that, for once, everything in my life matched the truth of it. There were no performances anymore. No pretending. No dinner tables full of tension disguised as tradition. I stopped trying to explain myself to people who didn't ask to understand. One of the hardest things to navigate was what to tell Bobby. Not just about the slap, but about the bigger picture, why we moved, why Daddy wasn't with us anymore. I didn't want to lie, but I didn't want to burden him with adult things either. So I told him what I could. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that aren't okay, I said one evening, as we sat side by side on the porch. And when someone doesn't stop them, that hurts people. So I made a choice to keep us safe. He nodded. "Because you're the mom." "Yes," I said. "Because I'm your mom." He didn't ask about Mia. He never brought her up again. There was one night, maybe a month after the move, when I woke up to find him standing in my doorway holding his blanket. "Can I sleep with you?" he asked. "Of course," I said, pulling back the covers. He climbed in and was quiet for a while. Then he whispered, "I like this house better. It doesn't feel tight." I didn't ask what he meant. I just said, "Me too." I spent those early months learning how to be 2 people at once, the parent and the provider. The soft place and the steel spine. There were moments when it felt impossible, like I was stretching too thin. But I'd get through the hardest days by anchoring to the simplest facts. Bobby was safe. I was safe. That was enough. Sometimes I'd get messages from Lance, thin attempts at guilt or veiled concern disguised as sarcasm. "Hope you're enjoying single-parent life. You think this is better for Bobby? No dad at home? Let me know when you're ready to be rational again." I stopped replying. There's something people don't talk about when they talk about leaving, how quiet it gets. Not just the absence of shouting or conflict, but the absence of noise in your own head. No more rehearsing conversations in advance. No more second-guessing every word. No more trying to anticipate someone else's reaction just to keep the peace. For the first time in years, I heard myself think. And I liked the sound of it. I started rebuilding. I made a list of everything that needed replacing emotionally, logistically, practically. I applied for a housing grant for single parents, worked with a family therapist to help Bobby process what had happened, started meal prepping on Sundays to make the week smoother. I bought secondhand furniture. Hung art I actually liked. Set boundaries I'd never dared to set before. And gradually, the weight started to lift. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. But it was the kind of tired that comes from moving forward, not holding back. And that made all the difference. One night, after Bobby went to bed, I sat on the living room floor with my laptop open and typed out a simple sentence. This is the first place I've ever lived that doesn't feel like I have to apologize for being here. Then I closed the laptop and let myself rest. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was peace. And it was honest. It took nearly 6 weeks before Lance formally requested visitation. By then, the initial dust had settled. Bobby had a new routine, and I had one too: early mornings, lunchbox notes, late-night emails to lawyers and insurance reps. I wasn't surprised when the court paperwork came in. In some ways, I'd been waiting for it. But seeing his name printed across from mine in a formal case title made everything feel heavier. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. Julia offered to watch Bobby so I wouldn't have to scramble. I didn't bring a lawyer, just notes and a very clear sense of where my boundaries were. When I walked into the room, Lance was already sitting there. He looked tired, paler than usual. His shirt wrinkled like he hadn't bothered to iron it. He didn't say anything right away, just nodded once like we were meeting about an overdue bill. I didn't respond. The mediator walked us through the basics: structure, expectations, options. When it was Lance's turn to speak, he didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He just said, "I didn't realize how far things had gone." I looked at him and said calmly, "That's the problem. You didn't realize." Not when Mia humiliated him. Not when he asked if he was a bad kid. Not when I walked out of your parents' house with our son holding his science project and tears in his eyes. He stayed quiet. "This isn't about you anymore," I added. "This is about Bobby feeling safe. That's the only priority here." The mediator asked what I was open to. I said supervised visits for now. A gradual introduction with check-ins and evaluations. No overnight stays. No contact with Mia. No exceptions. Lance agreed. Maybe because he knew there wasn't room to push back. Or maybe because, in his own way, he was starting to understand the difference between being involved and being accountable. The first visit was awkward. We met at a neutral facility, a clean, windowless room with board games and puzzles stacked on a shelf. Lance was nervous. I could tell by the way he kept adjusting his sleeves, like they didn't fit right. Bobby clung to me for a minute, then walked over slowly and sat down. I watched from the observation room. Lance tried. That much was obvious. He asked Bobby about school, about the frogs, about books. Bobby answered in short, careful sentences. His body stayed angled toward the door. After the hour was up, I met him outside. "How was it?" I asked gently. He shrugged. "Okay." We didn't force it. The next visit went a little better. Bobby let out a small laugh when Lance tried to make a paper airplane. He let him read a book out loud. Still careful, but a little less guarded. Meanwhile, Lance kept asking if we could move things along. Said he was going to therapy, that he was learning. I said that was good for him. But that my focus was Bobby. One afternoon, during a brief exchange after a session, he said, "You really don't trust me, do you?" I looked at him and said, "Trust isn't a given. Especially not now. You don't get it just because you noticed the fire you helped light." He nodded, almost like he expected that. But I could tell it stung. The truth is, I didn't hate him. I wasn't building a wall to keep him out of revenge or pride. I was building a boundary so my son wouldn't have to question whether he was protected. And honestly, it was strange seeing Lance try. For years, he'd been passive, reactive instead of proactive, always waiting for someone else to tell him what to do. Now, he was showing up to parenting classes, sending Bobby books, asking for feedback. The change was slow, but it was there. Still, I didn't mistake effort for transformation. A few people around us started whispering about reconciliation. Even Julia asked once, gently, "Would you ever reconsider if he keeps this up?" I told her the truth. This isn't about whether he becomes a better version of himself. It's about who he failed to be when it mattered most. Lance hadn't just watched his sister slap our son. He'd minimized it, dismissed it, then laughed about it in front of the whole family. That kind of failure leaves a scar. And just because he finally saw the smoke didn't mean he'd put out the fire. Bobby continued his slow, quiet healing. He started asking to bring books to the visits. Sometimes he came back with drawings Lance had helped him make. A rocket ship. A zoo. Once, a picture of a dad and a kid reading. I didn't say anything about that one. Just put it on the fridge and said it was beautiful. There was a stretch of weeks where Lance stopped pushing. He followed the schedule. Showed up on time. Kept it consistent. It was like he understood that the only way forward was slow and quiet. He asked once if I'd ever consider unsupervised visits. I said, not yet. And that was the end of it. I could tell he was trying to prove something. Maybe to the court. Maybe to himself. But I didn't let that change the terms. Because trust isn't given for effort. It's earned through consistency. And even then, it doesn't mean you get to have everything back. There was one evening, a few months into the process, when Bobby and I were sitting on the floor of our living room building a Lego spaceship. Out of nowhere, he said, "Daddy doesn't talk about Aunt Mia." I looked at him carefully. "What do you think about that?" He shrugged. "I think he knows she was mean." I nodded. "Do you feel okay talking about her?" "I don't miss her," he said. "Okay." He added a Lego wing to the ship, then looked up. "But I don't think Daddy's mean." I smiled. "I know. But you still get to be careful with your heart." He seemed to understand that in the way kids often do, without needing the words. That night, after he went to bed, I sat down with my journal and wrote just one sentence. We don't rebuild the same house. We build one where the roof doesn't leak. Trust might come later. Or it might not. But safety? That had already arrived. It's been over a year now. We live in a smaller place. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a tiny kitchen with cabinets that creak when you open them too quickly. The walls are thin and the laundry is a shared unit in the basement, but it's warm. Not just physically, though the radiator hums like an old friend, but emotionally. You can feel it when you walk in. There's laughter in this space. Music. Bad dancing on Saturday mornings. Crayon drawings taped to the fridge. Shoes left in the middle of the hallway because a 5-year-old got too excited to take them off properly. It's not perfect. But it's ours. Bobby's grown so much. He's 6 now, taller, louder, sharper in all the ways that matter. He asks 1,000 questions a day, sometimes before I've even finished my coffee. He's still in love with frogs, but now he's added dinosaurs and the solar system to his obsessions. He speaks with confidence again. No hesitations. No second-guessing whether he's allowed to finish a sentence. We sit down for dinner together every night. Sometimes it's a real meal, sometimes it's scrambled eggs and toast. But we always sit. And he always talks. And I always listen. That's the rule. He doesn't flinch anymore. Not when he gets excited. Not when he interrupts himself. Not when he spills water or drops a fork or raises his voice mid-story. Because he's never had to flinch here. Lance and I have settled into a rhythm. Not friends, not enemies, just co-parents with a fragile but functioning system. He sees Bobby every other weekend now. Unsupervised, but with boundaries. I still don't know what he says about me when I'm not there. But I've stopped worrying about that. He's been consistent. That matters. And Bobby seems comfortable with him. That matters even more. There are moments when I see something shift in Lance, when he hears Bobby talk about school, or watches him tell a long-winded story with hand gestures and sound effects, and I see a flicker of something like regret. Like he's remembering a version of himself that used to brush those stories off, or worse, laugh at them. I think he regrets laughing that night. But some moments draw lines you don't come back from. That was one of them. And I don't need an apology to know that. You can feel regret in silence, too. As for Mia, she's still herself, from what I hear. Still posting passive-aggressive memes. Still holding court at family dinners. Still surrounded by people too afraid to call her out or too indifferent to care. She never apologized. Not once. Not to me. Not to Bobby. Not even a text. And that tells me everything I need to know. Lance doesn't bring her around Bobby. Whether that's out of respect or court obligation, I don't ask. I just make it clear, if she ever raises a hand again, it won't be a conversation. It'll be a courtroom. Boundaries aren't warnings. They're policies. And I've stopped debating mine. Sometimes, people still ask how it all happened. Quietly. Carefully. Like they're trying not to pick a side but still want to understand. I give them the short version. My son was hit at dinner, and no one did anything. That's usually enough. Other times, it's the tone of voice people notice more than the story itself. The way I say it without anger, without drama. Just fact. That's what gets them. The stillness. Because for years, I thought being a good wife meant swallowing discomfort. Making peace at all costs. Letting things go. Laughing off comments. Covering up awkward silences with hospitality and effort and grace. I thought that was strength. But now I know, peace isn't something you beg for. It's something you build. Deliberately. Brick by brick. Choice by choice. And sometimes, you start with a slammed door and a packed bag. That door didn't slam in rage. It closed with purpose. Because I wasn't just walking away from a marriage. I was walking toward safety. Toward clarity. Toward a home where my son didn't have to question his worth for having a voice. We talk about boundaries now. I teach Bobby that they're not rude, they're necessary. I tell him, it's okay to say stop. It's okay to walk away. It's okay to protect your peace. The other day, he came home from school and said, someone pushed me in line. I told the teacher. I didn't push back. But I told her it wasn't okay. I looked him in the eye and said, I'm proud of you. He nodded, opened the fridge, and asked for a popsicle like it was the most normal thing in the world. And maybe it is. Maybe standing up for yourself becomes normal when you grow up watching someone do it for you. There are moments I still grieve. Not the marriage, I've made peace with that, but the time I spent trying to fix something that was never mine to fix. The years I spent hoping someone else would step in, speak up, share the weight. But I don't sit in that place long. I let it come. I let it pass. Because what came after, this version of life, stripped down and stitched back together with intention, it's more than I ever imagined for us. I don't flinch anymore either. I say no without guilt. I say yes when it's real. I ask for help. I forgive myself faster. I take up space in my own life without apologizing for the shape of it. And on quiet nights, after Bobby's gone to bed and the dishwasher hums softly in the background, I think about the woman I used to be. The one who thought endurance was love. The one who believed silence was strength. The one who sat at a dinner table and watched her son shrink under the weight of someone else's hand. I think about her. And then I thank her for getting up. For leaving. For walking out with dignity, even when her voice was shaking. Because that's when everything started. Not the moment she was hurt, but the moment she refused to stay small. That's the legacy I want to leave for my son. Not just that his mother loved him, but that she loved him enough to walk away from anything that made him doubt it. Thanks for listening. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Do you think some lines can ever be uncrossed, or once trust is broken, that's it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever had to choose peace over keeping the peace, I want to hear your story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more real stories about boundaries, self-worth, and the moments that change everything.